This is how I start the process for my random design cutting boards. I use extra strips of wood, and I even cut some strips specifically for this. The woods here I'm using is maple, walnut, cherry, padauk, and mahogany. I make sure to put plenty of glue on so there's plenty of squeeze out, and I use a ruler to make sure the glue is evenly spread. The clamps I use are Bessey clamps, and I use the two on the bottom, and I also put one on the top the opposite direction, because if you use clamps just on one side, sometimes it makes the board bow. And I try to scrape as much glue off as possible because then it's less scraping when the glue dries. I usually let the glue dry for 3 or 4 hours, sometimes overnight, before I unclamp it, and then I use an old chisel to scrape off the glue, mainly where the clamps were. Then I send them through the planer. This planer is a 20-inch Grizzly planer, and I love the thing. And each time I send it through, I flip them over because I believe that gets each board the flattest. I run the one edge through the jointer to get a straight edge, and then I use that straight edge to put it against the fence of my table saw sled, and I trim the edge to get a flat edge, and I use a stop block to make all the pieces the same. Now I want the finished cutting board to be 1.5 inches, so I cut these strips at 1.75 inches so there's room for planing later. Once I have a bunch of strips cut, I choose some from each pile, enough to make the length of a cutting board. And the table saw chips out sometimes on the edge, so I take each piece and send each side through the jointer, and it makes it nice and smooth. Now I try to randomly flip the pieces to try to have the most random design possible, so if 2 pieces of the same wood are beside each other, then I'll try to flip a piece and make it more of a random design. And now it's time for the glue up, and I sped this process up because I don't know if anybody would sit here for 3 minutes and watch me glue up. I put on the clamps and scrape off any extra glue. I let the glue dry overnight and take it out of the clamps, then I scrape any extra glue off with a chisel. I learned that routing a chamfer on the edge prevents the chip out when I send it through the planer. To get the first side flat, I use this planer sled, and I use hot glue on all the corners to keep it secure. This is because if the cutting board isn't flat, then it'll stay not flat when it goes to the planer, and since the sled is flat, it'll make the top flat. Next, I take the board off with a chisel, and I flatten the other side. I use my jointer to get one straight edge, and then I put that straight edge against my table saw sled. And I have markings on my table saw sled at 13 inches and 17 inches because I make a lot of cutting boards 13 by 17. In the next video I will show the sanding process. The first part of the sanding process, I use the drum sander, then I use the belt sander, then I use the orbital sander with 80 grit, then I put a chamfer on the edges. I do the corners first, and then I do the long edges. This is an adjustable juice groove jig I made that I can do different size cutting boards. And I found out that lifting at the corners helps prevent burn marks, because if I stay too long in a corner, then it'll burn with the router. I do the juice groove with 2 passes. And this is also another jig I made to do the handle grooves. And I made this block to make all my grooves the same. I set the bit to the same depth each time. Now I sand the edges with 120 grit, and also sand the juice groove with 120 grit. I sand with the orbital sander with 120 grit, then I spray water on the board to raise the grain, and I burn my logo, and sand everything with 220 grit. Now it's ready for the oil. The final step is the oil. I use cutting board oil, and the company is Walrus Oil, and since this board is end grain, it soaks up the oil more, so I make sure to apply plenty of oil. I made these drying racks, and I let the boards dry overnight, then I wipe away any extra oil. And this board is ready to be shipped off. What project should I do next?